Welcome. We come to the second half of Father Seraphim Rose on nihilism. And as I mentioned, we were coming to the fourth point, which was destructive nihilism. So we had mentioned he's mentioning the four sort of phases or stages, the last being the most consistent in a dark way and the most Luciferian. And that is the self-conscious, self-destructive nihilist. The idea that destruction is an act of creation, an act of the will, the nihilism of destruction. He said it is unique to our modern age. There has been destruction on a wide scale before, but there's never been an age where men gloried in that destruction. Until our own time, this has become a self-conscious plan, which didn't seem to exist before. He says this is an argument for it being an obvious work of Satan. The idea being to set up a program for this accomplishment as a rage against creation itself. The realist Bazarov, he's going to mention some of the pure anarchists who are the pure nihilists, could state that there is not a single institution in society that should not be completely destroyed. He wishes this to be a creative act. Whoever wishes to be creative, says Nietzsche, must first destroy and smash all accepted values. Creative destruction. The manifesto of the futurists, who were as perhaps near to pure nihilism as to vitalism, glorified war as the destroying arm of the anarchist. The destruction of the old order and the abolition of absolute truth were the admitted aims of the realists and the vitalists. In the pure nihilist, however, what to others was a prologue becomes an end in itself. So there's not a purpose in setting up a utopia, but embracing instead the nihil. One thinks here of characters such as Christopher Nolan's The Joker character, if you watched his Batman series. Heath Ledger as the Joker, the Joker in the film, if you remember, he's burning giant piles of money and people are confused. The other criminals are confused. Why are you burning millions of dollars? Why aren't you a criminal to make millions of dollars? And, the Joker says basically, no, I revel in just the destructive act itself. There's no method or means behind his terror actions in the film, the Joker I'm speaking of. He's doing it for the sake of chaos. Creative destruction. The passion for destruction is a creative passion, says the nihilist, says Nekhayev, one of these nihilists. And we see a similar pattern, although not an anarchist, but a similar idea in V.I. Lenin, with the idea of red terror being used for the purpose of, you could argue, aesthetic terror. Aesthetic terror being, of course, a sort of dark occult concept. You can find Church of Satan members talking about this. I recognize the Church of Satan is quite theatrical in many ways, but the idea is still relevant and is not just found in the church. It's also found in other occult groups. The idea that there is some sort of inherent power in the action of destroying. And so, in terms of arts, in terms of the weaponizing of arts, which Father Rose talks about, by the way, you have examples like Dadaism, Dada art, absurdism. He's going to make quite a few references to absurdism in this section and later on, where there's a whole chapter on absurdism and surrealism. And what we get here is really the worship of nothing. And he says the reason for that is because if you think about creation, the original state, the reason that we speak of God creating out of nothing is to preserve the fact that creation exists because of the will of God. God wills to create. It's not a thing that he did under any imminent necessity. It's not an emanation from his essence in Platonism or anything like that. He willed to create ex nihilo, out of nothing. And so if you understand the perspective of the nihilist in full conscious rebellion against that notion, that doctrine, that teaching from Revelation, right, the unique Christian doctrine of creation, then you can understand why they would want to return to the void, right? What is the inversion of that act? What is the destruction of the act of creation but to return to the void, the nihil, the nothing from whence creation came? And not many, but some of the nihilists, some of the very self-conscious Luciferian type nihilists do take that perspective. They do follow that out to its consistency. Not many, but a few. And Father Rose says that this is really a symptom of complete spiritual blindness, where the diseased eye, the diseased spiritual eye, the blinded eye of these figures becomes dogmatic, almost to the point of kind of chaotic, possessed frenzy. And we see that in some of these characters who commit these kinds of actions. He says that the theology and spirit of nihilism is, simply put, just satanic. It is ultimately a war on God and truth. But the difference, again, being that it is self-conscious, right? There's no pretenses here. There's no plausible deniability of, well, we're trying to set up a humanistic utopia. Well, we're trying to set up some nice fuzzy society based on progress and liberalism. No. Out with all that nonsense. It doesn't matter. Tear it all down. Right? Just tear it all down. It's all stupid. It's all gross. And the reason is that it's a more philosophical perspective, where there's an idea of, well, if we're going to say that there's no truth and there's no values, then the existence of things themselves is the problem. Why anything at all? Why existence? Why not no thing? Right? And why not return to no thing? So it begins again from the principle of self-consciously warring on the idea that there is truth at all. And thus it becomes a kind of frenzy, a kind of madness. And this madness needs a new prophet. And this is the figure of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. According to Seraphim Rose, this is the purpose of the Zarathustra character in the Nietzschean Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And this is, of course, the reason I think Nietzsche speaks of God as dead. This is from his work called The Joyful Wisdom. I think most of you guys probably are aware that it doesn't mean that God is literally dead. It means that in the mind of European Western civilization, God has been ejected. He's no longer needed. So he's dead in the minds of most Western Europeans. And Nietzsche is kind of getting at the point that, well, this actually hasn't been fully processed, because once we fully process this revolution in his mind and in other critics' minds begins in the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment, French Revolution, this begins the expelling of God from the social sphere, from the sciences, from society, from philosophy, academia, and eventually what you get is Nietzsche's arguing a society that's going through phases that's not really being consistent, right? I mean, the idea of progress, humanism, secularism, these lofty sounding goals are essentially nonsense, right? So again, more consistent atheism. And he brings in figures that we would expect, like Pierre Proudhon, the anarchist. Is it Pierre? Am I right? It's been a long time since I had my Marxist class, but I remember Proudhon was very influential in Marx. And Proudhon was very self-consciously not just an atheist, but an anti-theist, right? And so the self-conscious nihilist would take on the role of warring against the idea of God, not just being agnostic, not just saying there is no God, but actually warring against God and theism. And in this way, it becomes more self-consciously satanic. For some of the individuals here, there might be a notion of God in the sense of the earlier phases that we mentioned, but here there's no God. Man is God. So, whereas Robespierre might have tried to set up a cult of the supreme being because, of course, it had Masonic influences, when we come to the self-conscious nihilists, there's no more pretenses, as we said. But as he says, the one way we know that this is satanic and stupid is that anti-theism is a spiritual malady, he says. And, David says in the Psalms, the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. So atheism is not, in fact, a rational position. It is, in fact, a foolish position. The wisdom of this world is foolishness before God, Paul says. And then we have other characters who could fit into maybe the progressive humanist atheist perspective, like a Bertrand Russell. But Bertrand Russell, of course, at times seems to be a divided character. All of this, in my view, this democratic humanist stuff that he spouted was just for public consumption. He was probably self-consciously one of the dark nihilists, in my view. But he has this sort of argument that, if you are a Christian, it's only because you're a weak-minded person, which is an appeal to emotion. So that's ironic coming from somebody who supposedly was a master logician. When arguing against Christianity in his famous essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, what's the first thing he relies on? Why it's an emotional appeal. Only weak people believe this. Well, that's not a valid argument. But back to the nihilists, the idea here is a kind of worship of nothingness, if not self-conscious, then implicitly. The idea here being that not only are we intentionally doing this action of anti-theism, we're literally saying that everything should be no thing. So it's actually a sort of ontological war. And you could see why these people would worship war and destruction, and ultimately something like the idea of splitting the atom. Primordial destruction and return to chaos from order. And not just a return to chaos, but actually a return to the abyss, as we mentioned in part 1. A return to the void, a return to non-being. This is conceived of as a kind of willful action towards the demonic, towards the satanic, that could even be viewed in a ritualistic way. It's it's that because it's the most perfect inversion of Christianity, the most perfect inversion of our position, right? I mean, so it's not like a clownish sort of theatrical Hollywood Church of Satan type of thing where we're saying, we don't actually believe in any spiritual entities or anything like that. We just believe in pleasure and Darwinian dominance, right? That's the public confession, at least, of the Church of Satan, for example. Here we have something a little more self-consciously, philosophically evil, which is, no, we actually want to make a war on the idea of absolute truth. One could think here of my talk on anarchism and progressivism that I did maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, where we have actually a talk on Marxism and anarchism, critiquing them. And I use as a primary example the famous essay, which I don't think is available publicly anymore. It used to be publicly available, but by the famous literary critic Umberto Eco. And Eco is very consistent in his piece because he says that really all liberalism is at root revolutionary. But it's not just revolutionary against some mythical 20th century fascist that doesn't really exist anymore, or against, like the SS or something, right? When you're not fighting the SS or any secret Nazi groups everywhere. It's not a war against capitalism or a war against Donald Trump. Really, the war, he argues, I mean, he wasn't writing about Trump, but, same idea. The war isn't modern progressivism's idea of what they're supposed to be fighting for, social justice or whatever. The real war is against the idea of truth itself. And so we have to give credit to Mr. Umberto Eco for being so honest and being so candid there. Thank you for finally telling us that what the liberal of all flavors is really at war against is a metaphysical principle, an epistemological principle, and an ethical principle. There is no truth, and by extension, there is no goodness, and by extension, there is no good or evil. And so everyone who believes that there's good and evil, that there's God, that there's absolute truth, by extension, is who Echo says must be destroyed. That is who the battle of the liberal is really against. And that's why you know that Umberto Eco was pretty self-consciously a Luciferian. I mean, we have this kind of this idea of the sort of Luciferian destruction in his novel, The Name of the Rose. The modern world burns just like the traditional world burns to the ground, just like the monastery, spoiler alert, burns to the ground in the story. And so we have a return to the abyss that is in fact intentional. Here we get the ideas of, I also think of, like, remember, if you're a rock fan or something, alternative fan, then you'll remember in the 90s, Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins went into this phase where he was, it was all about zero, right? And he was always wearing t-shirts that had zero, and he kind of had this sort of Luciferian nihilist perspective for a while. I think he says at least that he no longer has those views anymore, but he at least had that phase, and I think that what he was trying to exemplify in that era of the Smashing Pumpkins after the Melancholy album was this principle and spirit of nihilism. And so creation returning to destruction is then a perfect inversion, a return to the void. It makes me think of that horror movie. I don't really recommend it. It's pretty gruesome, but it's kind of made in the vein or in the spirit of John Carpenter. But there was an kind of independent horror movie that came out a couple of years ago called The Void. And typically I don't really watch horror movies. I do enjoy supernatural thrillers, and it's kind of what this was, but it kind of had the kind of gross sort of gooey monster type of thing that was very John Carpenter-esque. But you had in the Void the idea of this cult sort of appearing and kind of terrorizing these people that were stuck in a hospital, and you get the impression that this is sort of an apocalyptic kind of end times thing. This cult has kind of been released, and then, spoiler alert, we find out that the leader of this cult had sort of come through this portal, and the portal led to the void, the abyss, right? In the spiritual sense, like we see, for example, in the book of Revelation, you have in the apocalypse, the opening of the abyss, and these fallen demonic entities who had been chained up were let loose. Same kind of idea in that film, The Void, and kind of goes along again with the point that Father Rose is making here. Again, I'm not saying that the Void's kind of gruesome. I don't know if I would recommend that movie, but that's getting at the idea here. And by extension, of course, the people of this perspective seem to realize that their true enemy is the church. It is Christ. So they're not just sort of indifferent to religion or Christianity. They're absolutely at war with truth. They're absolutely at war with the Bible, with Christ. They realize that that's what must be destroyed. So they want to destroy not just some idea, but the actual church. One of the key weapons of this force is absurdism. And what absurdism does is it tries to interject the impossible, the illogical, and the irrational, not for fun or not for satire purposes or for comedic purposes or literary purposes. It may utilize literary mediums, or it may utilize comedic mediums, but this is more self-consciously possessing the intention of trying to destroy truth through modern degenerate art, through Dada, through surrealism, right? So the intention is key here. Right? The intention is a big part of this. And he says that one of the reasons why this is wrong is that everything ultimately is oriented to God. There's no neutral zone where God isn't sovereign, where you can posit and argue that, oh, well, over here in this realm, we actually can have rebellion against God. He again quotes the Joyful Wisdom of Nietzsche, number 125, which is the full section about the death of God, the famously misused quote. But we get we understand from this that what Nietzsche's overall point was, which was that Western man had banished God from his mind. Again, he stresses that ultimately this is satanic, and one of the key figures would be Proudhon. Vatican II exemplifies this spirit of trying to mesh the world with the church, trying to compromise the spirit of revolution, the spirit of Satanism, because even Father Rose points out that there's an obvious change between the Western Church, namely the Church of Rome, pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II. And let's see, when was he writing this? I'm not sure what year this book came out in. I'm not sure when he wrote this, because he died in 1982, but this was printed many years later. So we don't actually know that. I'm sure somebody can figure out, but I don't know the date of when he wrote this essay, but I presume it was after Vatican II, given the fact that he is discussing the compromises of the Roman Church, particularly exemplified in Vatican II. Certainly the modernism had crept into Rome definitely prior to Vatican II, right? Or else there wouldn't have even been Vatican II. The nihilist program sees the power to dogmatizing the absurd. If you dogmatize the absurd and the surreal, it has the effect of essentially messing with people's mind. Off the top of my head, it makes me think of, like, if you remember in 1984, there's some areas where O'Brien tortures Winston, and he does absurd things. And he's doing the absurd things not just to kind of, train Winston to submit, but to really mess with his mind, with his psyche. And that's kind of what I came to when I was reading this section, because he mentions these totalitarians, the totalitarian type regimes, and he mentions again some of these characters that were even more consistent, like the nihilists, the anarchists, Nekhayev or Bakunin. And the reason they're a little more consistent is that they understood that a lot of the elements of the art, particularly the degenerate art, modern art, abstract art, aided by not communists everywhere, but actually the CIA, right? Frankfurt School and the CIA working in tandem to promote modern abstract degenerate art. Some of these higher levels, higher strata people who were serious about their Satanism took it as a key means by which the old order could be destroyed. And by old order, we mean the older traditional organic Christendom, European, biblical, absolute truth, monarchy perspective. And then that's not me, that's what Father Rose says. He includes an interesting quote, too, from Goebbels and some of the Hitler individuals, Hitler types, Hitler followers, Hitler people, arguing that they were, in fact, not a traditional group at all, but in fact were revolutionary. The Nazis, this is my perspective, this is what I've always argued, is that Nazism is a revolutionary force. It is part of the revolutions of the revolutionary spirit and ethos of the last 3-4 centuries. It has an appearance of pagan traditionalism, but that is all cut and paste concocted in my view. And so Father Rose has the same perspective on that. And quite simply, that's because the Nazis were opposed to the church and the monarchy. And the only aspects that they thought were positive in Christianity or the church were the ones that could be pragmatically used. So really nothing Christian about it. And both Nazism and Bolshevism shared the same idea that the old order had to be torn away. So, again, Nazism and Bolshevism are revolutionary forces. You look at their artwork, it's almost exactly the same. Except instead of the Aryan guy, you put the worker. Another aspect that he was pretty prescient about in this book was foreseeing the connection between technocracy, eugenics, and mind control on the part of any of these revolutionary systems leading to this kind of top-down technocratic control system. And he's very candid about that at the bottom of page 78. He says that all of these technocratic, socialist, capitalist, revolutionary systems, they lead to this idea of regimented population control, deciding who's born and who's not, trying to control genetics and heredity, and the creation of a giant welfare state, and experiments to control the mind, he says. He's talking about MK Ultra. Social planning, total planning, managed society, welfare state, blah, blah, blah. Merging and coalescing into a regimented technocracy. So very, very prescient quote and section there on page 78. And all those systems, of course, had in mind the creation of the new man, right? This is a Marxist idea, again, not incompatible with Nietzsche and fascism. The new man is the idea of the Übermensch, whether it's the collective new man of the working class or the Übermensch, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, those are things that have passed away. And the new idea is transhumanism. And Father Rose perceived that. He saw that what this would lead to was actually a dehumanization and the idea of becoming post-human. There is amongst many of the nihilists and serious satanic anarchists the idea of magical violence through bloodshed. They will literally ascribe a kind of power, and even perhaps at times an occult power, to bloodshed. Red Terror, again, the Reds. Well, what were the Reds? What is red? Red is Mars, red is blood. And so the idea of bloody red terror is quite literally conceived of as a force within the world to create change. In a way, guess what? Blood ritual. And this is set over against, of course, the traditional order, which does not see or view war as having an inherent magical power. Human nature is subject to plasticity, right? We saw this in H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, very ahead of his time in The Island of Dr. Moreau, positing the plasticity of man, and that man could, through external stimuli, social engineering factors, be consciously evolved, so to speak, into something else, into change, into transhumanism. This new man is a worshiper of scientism and the idea of brute fact. There's not any such thing as a brute fact, of course, and Father Rose kind of hints at that there. Page 83. And he gives some other examples of modern degenerate art. Picasso, obviously. Cubism. Give me a break. It's disgusting. Nothing beautiful or interesting about that. Actually intended to be a kind of mutation. And he has this weird thing about children of thalidomide. If you're the ultimate boomer song, of course, is Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," and he mentions the children of thalidomide, which was some thing in the babies that were deformed as a result of some chemical used during pregnancy, a drug called thalidomide. And he has a strange paragraph where he says that there was some modern artist who appears to have predicted this in his artwork. Where is this? I'm looking for the name of the artist where he talks about this. I guess he's talking about this character named Giacometti. I'm not really familiar with Giacometti, but he goes on to say that the bodies this creature assumes are distorted and violent, twisted, dismembered. Mutations, etc. Could you imagine if he saw H.R. Giger? What would you say about Giger's art? One cannot therefore notice the likeness between some of these figures and artworks, photographs, and the deformed children born recently, 2000s, of women through thalidomide. Is this merely a coincidence? I don't know. But the point being is that the purpose of the artwork is to dehumanize. And it's not just to dehumanize for no reason, but it also relates to transhumanism, which he kind of hints at here, the biological Superman. He talks about biological determinism essentially leading to this perspective, and the idea that, well, if God is dead, then it kind of logically follows that man also is dead. So again, we have this idea of the creation of the new man, but the new man must change and become the non-man. Man is what must go away. This is the central tenet of the revolutionary faith. And this is where it ties into the New Age. Right? The New Age is not disconnected from this. The New Age is not all warm fuzzies and pyramids and enlightenment. There is a dark, dark, dark side to what was really going on with the New Age. A dark Crowleyan ethos to the New Age, Luciferian side to that New Age stuff. Again, documented in many, many books, not even controversial anymore. A mechanized new earth is the end goal here. So he talks about a kind of global technocratic government. Again, Father Rose very ahead of his time here, sounding like a conspiracy theorist. And many of these characters, he says, did have occult interests and backgrounds, whether they were from the National Socialist camp with the Thule Society and all that goofy esoteric stuff with Himmler, or whether they're from the Bolshevik side of things. Some of the Bolsheviks were into Satanism and Eyes Wide Shut type stuff. Mark Hackert has an essay on that at Espionage History Archive, and then all the way back to the French Revolution, where you had plenty of characters there who so-called revolutionaries, atheists, but they just happen to also seemingly be Satanists. And then he kind of fast forwards up to modern examples of somebody like W.B. Yeats, also again in the ceremonial magic circles, of course. And one thinks here of the Yeats poem about the coming of the Antichrist, right? The beast that slouches his way towards Bethlehem. In other words, almost like he's going to be born there. And this gets into the nihilistic perspective on what they call transvaluation of all values, which he cites a section of Nietzsche talking about the fact that, well, since there are no values, the actions of the true nihilist are just pure actions of pure will to power, basically. And that's why this system leads directly to tyrannical regimes. And he mentions literary examples. Of course, Mark Hackert has brought this up before in many talks. The example of some of the characters in Dostoevsky's Demons, or The Possessed, right, the famous novel, and you have there the socialists, and this was written, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution and all that. Prior to the 20th century socialist revolution, they are the socialists talking about in a prophetic statement that true socialism will only come on a mountain of millions of skulls, and that's exactly what happened, right, in the revolution. And so the idea here is, we're going to have the apotheosis of man, but oops, sorry, we got to kill everybody to get that. I mean, really, that's the essence of it. We don't have to get all philosophic about it. That's what it amounts to. And we saw this. Remember, this theme was in H.G. Wells. Remember, H.G. Wells was fairly candid in New World Order and Open Conspiracy, basically kind of just saying, well, look, we're going to have a utopia. It's not for any of you. It's for the elite, but you know what? Why not die for a noble cause? It's more or less what he says in the book. We're going to have Star Trek. You're not going to have any part in that, but you can contribute to the noble effort of us having Star Trek by dying and doing what we say. And he's, Father Seraphin wrote that this is really the exemplification of the principles of the fallen angel himself. Ultimately, this philosophy is satanic. Nihilists are the prophets of Satan, he says. They are the emissaries of the fallen angel. And this ultimately is the Antichrist kingdom. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, we know from Scripture. And these characters are the most perfect rebels because they're in rebellion against everything, even their own human nature. And many of these guys, actually, to be consistent, they actually do commit suicide, because what's the most rebellious act against yourself and God? Committing suicide. And many of these characters, of course, have done that. He says the philosophy is dialectical. No surprise there. We've talked about dialectics many times. And he says again that it is a spiritual disorder, and it can be overcome only by a spiritual means. Right? There's no secular means that can stop the juggernaut of the atheistic the atheistic nihilistic technocracy that's coming. Whether or not it's the final Antichrist system, we don't know, but he says that this Antichrist system will rule wherever Christ doesn't. And now Christ rules everywhere, but the point being is that wherever Christians fail and the church fails, again, consistent pattern throughout Scripture. Read the letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in the first 3 chapters of the book of Revelation, and we see that the warning there, of course, if you fail, you're essentially, the churches there are more or less governed by the blessings and curses, actually, in Deuteronomy. There's a direct parallel between the things that Jesus offers as blessing to the churches when they're faithful and the warnings that he gives, the chastisements and so forth. Again, echoing the covenant curses and blessings of Deuteronomy 28, I think, 28 to 30 in there. Well, that's once again just shows the perfect continuity between the Old and the New Testament. Father Rose goes on to talk about perfect possession. It seems to be that some people possess a kind of perfect demonic spirit, almost like an inversion of theosis, maybe. And he cites the character Father Zosima in the Brothers Karamazov. And Father Zosima there speaks of one of the principles of the nihilists, the perfect possession idea. We see a foretaste of hell, he says, in some of these guys, these supremely Luciferian and nihilistic characters and philosophers. They have a foretaste of hell. They're miserable people, often quite open about that, their misery, kind of reveling in it, their nihilism and meaninglessness. And he says that they are kind of already in the abyss. And so he says that just that there's kind of a foretaste of this existential reality in the life of the atheistic, nihilistic, Luciferian type person. You get the same kind of foretaste for the righteous, right? We begin to participate in theosis, in the divine life, in this life, in the same way that some of these characters, these nihilists, already begin to participate in hell, in Hades, in death. And he actually, now a lot of people would say, well, there's not a lot of similarity between the kind of river of fire conception of the afterlife and Father Seraphim Rose, but actually on page 99, he gives a river of fire exposition. He says that one of the things that will torment the wicked in the afterlife is the love of God, because they will be forever in the presence of his love, because love is a never-ending kind of uncreated energy that always radiates from the presence of God. That is precisely what will torment the wicked. And so in this regard, yes, even Father Rose is backing up the principle that the river of life that we see in the Apocalypse, which is the river of life that proceeds from the throne of God, is no different than what Hebrews says, that our God is a consuming fire. And that's no different than the lake of fire. They are the same thing. And Father Rose says it on page 99. There is then a sort of thirsting for annihilation and non-being, but of course that is not going to happen. By the virtue of Christ uniting himself to universal human nature, that's the reason why all men are resurrected. That's the reason why everybody is predestined, absolutely, to go into the afterlife in a body, not just in some sort of floating ethereal spirit, but all men are going to be resurrected. Amazingly, this idea, which is quite obvious and quite common in the first millennia of Christianity, and even up in the last few, what really has only been kind of lost in the last few centuries of so-called Christianity in the West. The idea that all men aren't resurrected, that you're just sort of floating spirits, this weird Gnostic idea. No, all men are resurrected, and our state of being in the afterlife is essentially determined by the way that we live in this life. In other words, the mode of willing that we engage in this life is what determines the mode of being that we experience in the next life. The final section is an appendix on absurdism itself, where we talk about surrealism and we talk about Dadaism and Cubism and this kind of stuff, absurdity for the sake of absurdity. One thinks perhaps here of, what's that? Church of the Subgenius. This is a kind of a satirical thing. I think Robert Anton Wilson, right, had some kind of affiliation with this thing. One of these Crowleyan type influence characters who wrote pop novels about the Illuminati trilogy, Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson. We might be tempted to dismiss Wilson as maybe too poppy, but actually no. Robert Anton Wilson was self-consciously Luciferian, and so what you get with Wilson is a pretty open perspective on things like dialectics, manipulating paradigms, manipulating two sides of the coin, and Robert Anton Wilson actually brings this up in multiple books. What is it, Lucifer Rising? It's been so. I read two of the books many years ago, but so the titles are escaping me off the top of my head, but. This is essentially what he posits, right? He says that the true initiate is a kind of a Gnostic Luciferian who doesn't get trapped by any ideology, right? And so he says things like, read every perspective. And thus you could see why, if Father Rose were to speak about or critique Robert Anton Wilson, which he probably was aware of him, I'm sure they were alive at the same time at a certain point. Robert Anton Wilson being, connected to this absurdist philosophy, not in just a kind of jokey way, or it's not just comedy or satire. It's actually an intentional ritual working. And even though the Church of Subgenius is a joke, it's kind of like meme magic in the sense that, meme magic might start out as trolling, but it has the intention ultimately of actually affecting a change. And so in that way, surrealism and absurdism and all these things are worth paying attention to. Not because I think they're great or, the most insightful, but in many ways they are kind of insightful, because you could think of something like David Lynch. I mean, the films are surrealistic in many ways, but if you watch something like Twin Peaks, one reason or what way that Lynch would differ from a lot of the sort of bland, meaningless, cookie cutter pop culture stuff is that the spirituality and mythology of Twin Peaks is pretty self-consciously esoteric. So Lynch understands good and evil. He understands there's occult groups. He understands there's demons. He understands these things are real. He doesn't have the orthodox perspective, obviously, but he understands that, at least in his art, that's what he's presenting, and that's much closer to reality, you could say, in a certain way. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's orthodox, but it's a closer approximation to the real spiritual realm than, I don't know, who's an atheistic filmmaker or like just some pop trash or something, right? That's not going to talk about, the reality of ritual, the reality of spiritual warfare, this kind of stuff. Another interesting point that's made, that actually Van Til makes this point, that Father Rose echoes that point, and that is, and I had one guy one time in chat brought this up, which is a great question, a pretty deep philosophical question, but don't let me lose you here. It's actually not that obscure. The question is, well, what about incoherence or things that seem absurd? I mean, we do actually see in our experience things that are incoherent. We do see and experience things that are irrational. How can you posit that reality is at root rational, meaningful, and under the providence of God and the sovereignty of God, etc., when you have to make room for what appears to be the irrational? And the solution is that, well, even irrationality is rational. That's actually a direct quote from Van Til, and Father Rose says the exact same thing. He says in the Christian worldview, the Christian perspective, irrationality is still rational because it's subsumed, you could say, in the overall umbrella of everything being rational and God's permissive will, right? God permitting even evil events to occur that may seem irrational. We might encounter events that seem incoherent, but just because we don't see all the connections or all the purposes behind things doesn't mean that necessarily it is irrational. And even somebody who is an irrational actor, we could say, in history, an absurdist, a nihilist, a being, an actor within history intent on destruction or revolution or whatever, hardcore nihilist, even they will still serve the providence of God in the long run, even though we don't know or can't see all those connections and relations. The point is that Christianity, he says, is a religion of coherence. Everything in the universe is coherent and coheres, even in a mysterious way, the permission of evil. And so the absurdist attempt to make ultimate irrationality the rule and the norm fails. And the rational-irrational dialectic, by the way, is, of course, a consistent pattern that you'll notice when you interact with the atheist. Right? The atheist perspective is always in a dialectical tension within themselves between attempting to be, on the one hand, supremely rational. The universe is governed by reason and order, and ultimately that's just in the atheist's own mind because he has himself in the place of God in that worldview. But at the same time, in his worldview, everything is meaningless, chaos, there is no order, right, other than what he himself imposes. And that is the root presuppositional flaw and dialectical tension that you want to point out every time you're engaging with an atheist, is that he wants the best of both worlds. He wants there a world structured like there's a God with providence and order and symmetry and reason and logic, as he attempts to turn around and argue against the possibility of there being a God who is the basis for logic, order, ethics, etc. That's the strongest argument against atheism. And so absurdism and this kind of revolutionary aesthetic is an action of will. It is a will to power. It is a war against not just truth, but also telos. It must destroy purpose, and so therefore nothing can have purpose. Purpose must be banished. And he said, Father Rose says, well, even though there might be, I thought this was an interesting way to characterize comparative religion or truth in other religions. He says it could be helpful to speak of the possibility of there being truths or truthful ideas or propositions in other religions or philosophical systems about what none of those philosophical systems, be it Hindu or Chinese philosophy or whatever, will or could possibly posit is absolute truth. And that's good. That makes a lot of sense. And that accords with a lot of the other critiques if you read Girard's Tradition and the Traditions essay, which is a good illustration of this, or if you read Father Stan Eloy's Orthodox Dogmatics Volume 1, he makes the same point, basically that there's not really the easiest way to critique these other impersonalist religions, right? The Hindu type religion or something Far Eastern, is to point out that absolute reality is neither absolute truth nor absolutely personal. And in our philosophy, particularly Orthodox Christianity, it's the only one where the absolute is absolute truth and absolute personality, absolute person. That's a key insight that Stan Eloy makes. And he, again, makes the point that the attempt of the nihilists is this sort of futile, revolutionary ritual action to return everything to the abyss, to the void of Genesis 1. So it is a sort of counter-creationist action. He goes into avant-garde art. He mentions The Strange World of Kafka, the plays of Ionescu, and less strikingly of Beckett, and of a few avant-garde films. And he mentions some obscure foreign film I've never heard of, The Last Year at Marienbad. He talks about techno. Interesting. Well, I guess it wouldn't be techno yet, but there would be like synthesizer music, experimental music. Bowie was doing a lot of kind of experimental music at this time. And overall surrealism, he says, is an attempt to man is depicted in these as a subhuman and demonic creature. Well, yeah, if you think of the what do we say about the Alien series, right? The philosophy of the Alien series, Ridley Scott's Alien. Now, obviously, those are not they're not surrealist films at all. They're more just classical horror films, you could say. But what they do is they portray man. The whole entire Alien franchise, the whole point of it is that man is an abortion, right? The chaotic Gnostic world in which we live has accidentally produced the evolutionary abortion of man. And that's precisely the reason that Ridley Scott or whoever made the decision to include the artwork of H.R. Giger, because the completely demonic artwork of, if you're familiar with Giger, you know that it's like the most demonic artwork out there. Very, very famous artist. There's nothing more demonic than that. And the whole of that artwork seems to be portraying this very idea that the man himself is the great abortion. The universe is a great abortion, which shouldn't be here, right? Which is, again, a Gnostic concept. He kind of hints at a little bit of the social justice stuff a little bit here, page 109. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that the disillusionment with humanism in Europe in the past 5 centuries has resulted in nothing but a just completely absurd, failed attempt to erect a civilization of humanism. And this liberalism that it's based on, which is again a bastardization of Christian values without Christianity, which ultimately leads to nihilism. And he says nihilism leads to the absurd, and it leads to hell. And he says this is a logical flow to these worldviews and to this in history. There's no escaping this dark logic that when you adopt the principles and programs of liberalism, it will logically lead you down the road to nihilism and technocracy and self-destruction. There's no other options. There's a dark logical consistency to it. And it doesn't matter if the first generation of the revolutionaries didn't see this. It might take 300, 400, 500 years for this to come to fruition. But it's not hard to figure out if you follow through the presuppositions of this worldview. All right? And Nietzsche did. Nietzsche was very consistently presuppositional in that way. I'm not saying he was a presuppositionalist, but he was more consistent than the Enlightenment rationalists and skeptics. Nietzsche saying, look, this is all bullshit. If this is true, what you guys are saying, then there is no true. And let's be consistent here, right? The end result is not erecting institutions on the basis of noble truths, but power, will to power. All of history is not so much class warfare, but power warfare, power dynamics. So even though Nietzsche is typically seen as a kind of fascist sort of right-wing figure, in many ways he also predicts or presages the sort of social justice perspective and postmodernism, precisely because, although they're not consistent, one of the guiding principles of the radical social justice, social feminist types, or the radical postmodernist types is that it's just power dynamics. So they actually share that from Nietzsche, right? It's no longer ideological dynamics that primarily motivate or the moving focus of history and human action. It's just power dynamics, and that could be any kind of power dynamics. It could be wealthy, could be the elite, could be the patriarchy dominating women, right? Any of these sort of imagined dynamics could be conceived of and fit into power dynamics, right? So again, you could view it in many ways kind of like Marxism, but instead of it being class warfare, it's a power dynamic warfare. And the aesthetic expression of this worldview, again, is absurdism, Dada, degenerate modern abstract art, all this kind of stuff. And what does it mean ultimately? Well, it means self-worship. Tower of Babel, we're back at Babel. We're back at do what thou wilt. He gives some more literary examples, and he says you can actually now see the demonic on display in artwork. Yes, if you have not looked through a contemporary art book or art magazine, I encourage you to. You will find nothing but probably 90%, or go to a art exhibit by a college class of graduating seniors doing their final projects, or grad school students doing their final grad projects. I've been to many of these. I'm not making this up. Google them online. 90% will be completely demonic. I'm not joking. There will be, because of course the artistic class of society is in many ways more directly influenced by the spiritual realm. And when society as a whole becomes demonic, it's not surprising that the predominance of artworks that are produced are self-consciously demonic. Again, I just maybe scroll through some artwork that comes from recent art grads or whatever. And it doesn't even matter what school you go to. I guarantee you, just pick a random school, pick the school in your state, pick the school closest to you, wherever you live, pick the closest state university or whatever, arts school of art and design or whatever, and look at some of the graduating senior artworks. I guarantee you, at least 75%, maybe 90%, will be grotesque. It will be bizarre in a weird, not creative way. It will be portraying completely degenerate messages, all conditioned by this nonsense education system. And again, ultimately because this stuff is at root demonic. And so he says that ultimately the system is antichrist, maybe not necessarily the literal antichrist, but it is the result of Western civilization going into apostasy. And now, of course, that's not to say that Eastern civilization didn't, but Western civilization is, I think, more self-consciously demonic now. And then he says that we don't know if this is the end times. It could be. But regardless, we know that the system that has arisen is now, again, self-consciously demonic. And again, we need to look no further than the prevalence of what's predominantly the themes of the artwork. Right? Art reflects the soul of a society, of a culture. And ours are self-consciously demonic. Let me show you, just in case somebody's watching this. We haven't really shown a whole lot of videos or video imagery, but here, if you're watching or listening to the YouTube here, you can, or if you're watching on audio, click over to the YouTube version of this. And just for example, I'll show you some of H.R. Giger's artwork, which again is, obviously completely demonic. There's really no question about it. He was into all of the, occult, esoteric stuff. You got dead babies everywhere. Pretty gross stuff. It's very alien. Well, I mean, alien in the sense of the movie, obviously, because he was one of the concept artists for the movie, but his art was chosen. But I'm saying alien also in the sense of the demonic. Maybe you could make an argument that you could prove aliens are demons by the artwork of Giger. I mean, look at this. This is really pretty gross. What the heck's going on here? Don't know what that is, but it looks kind of gross. A lot of it's very sexual, not in a way that's going to turn anybody on, by the way. I guarantee you're not going to, unless you got something really wrong with you, you're not going to be turned on by the sexuality of these images. They're just really just completely demonic. I mean, there's no other way around it. Bizarre, gross, demonic. I mean, these are obviously demons, right? Well, anyway, so you can see then that let's just do an experiment here. This could be fun. Let's see. College senior, and we're going to test and see. I have no idea what's going to come up. Let's see if we can test that thesis that I have, that senior art projects, college senior art projects. I can't type. And then we'll see. I don't know what schools are going to come up, but should be probably just random, I guess. Okay, so here's one. A chunk of wood. Maybe they're not demonic anymore. They're just dumb. It's just complete nothing. Here's a deer made of bricks. Okay, that's weird. I don't know. It's not really demonic, but it's definitely, I guess, surrealist in a way. That one's not too bad. It's kind of pretty. That's just an art project. I don't know if that's a college. Here's a bunch of pieces of paper floating in the air. It's kind of lame. A floating hill. Oh, that's not too bad. Maybe the artists have gotten less demonic. That's pretty ugly. Hideous. Don't know what's going on there. This is kind of dissociated kind of faces looking here. Not sure what's going on there. That's not completely ugly, but certainly not beautiful. Here's a great one. The word "I love" in graffiti. Yeah, that's pretty much garbage there. It's a good example there. Here's a wall of doodles, garbage. Here's a screaming demonic face. Here's a screaming demonic body, sort of falling to pieces. Skeletons, bodies, yeah. It's fashion or something. What do we got here? Trippy floor pieces, people taking masks off. Dissociation, maybe? I don't know. So let's see. We'll just do a couple more of these. I don't want to bore you guys, but I do want to just test out the theory. Let's see. Here's a millennial tripping acid and having a bad trip, looks like. Not terrible, but not attractive. That's pretty crappy. Minimalism. Here's a pile of dirt with some looks like a cabinet or washing machine broken apart. That's a good one. That's a really good example. Like, let me hang a bunch of pieces of a washing machine in a box. That's a good one. It's not too bad. That was kind of funny. Yeah. Muskrat on wrapping paper. I could do a whole show just critiquing and making fun of art. That would be kind of funny. Let's see what this one is. Blurry nonsense. That's nothing. Racks of nothing. Basketball floating in the air. A piece of crap horse. Looks like garbage. Ugly faces. Yeah, so far we've seen everything kind of just distorted. Here's a good one. Sophomore, senior art project. Yeah, demons, literal demons, whispering and trying to possess a dude. More demons possessing a dude. Yeah, that's demon, giant tattoo. No, that's not an art piece. Isn't that pretty? Just nothing, nonsense, coloring like we're 10-year-olds. Can you imagine going from Renaissance? I'm not saying the Renaissance is perfect, but the beauty of the Renaissance in terms of just the skill from that to that. What is that? A gay cat? Come on. What else have we got? Oh, here's a good one. What? What is that? Pile of trash. It says this is a final arts project for University of Florida. Giant pile of trash. Good job, bro. Here's some more piles of trash on the wall. So basically, it's all just trash. Just throw trash on the wall. And that's your senior project. It's another pile of trash. Yeah, well, I didn't get as many art projects. I'm not getting good images here. What's this? Giant. I don't know what that is. Rotten cheese. Here's some more. Can't see those. What is this? Is this a canyon? That's not bad. That's kids. Here we go. Floating headless bodies. That's garbage surrealism. Ooh, that's good. Giant boxes of bags of Cheetos. Box bags of Cheetos. Some Andy Warhol type stuff there. So yeah, literal just garbage everywhere. Let's see what this is. Oh, it looks like furniture. What is this? You. Nothing. Giant pictures of letters with fire. Giant numbers, meaninglessness, nonsense. Yeah, it's just literally awful. Oh my gosh, look at this. You can't tell whether you're looking at a kid painting, like here's kids painting something, like finger paint, and what's supposed to be the high-end elite art. Which, by the way, I bet you there's a lot of con man scammery going on in that world. That's a big part of that. Let's see. Can we see those? I can't tell what that is. Floating hands. There's a painting of nothing. Standing there literally looking at a box of nothing. What is this? Looks like something you draw in your Trapper Keeper, your folder in high school when you're bored. Yeah, just more nothingness. That looks like it might be okay, but it's intentionally unfinished. Right? Oh, it's like trying to make a statement that life is unfinished and who we are is unfinished. Here's another one. Big pile of garbage again. Well, they love these. They love the piles of garbage. Sticks and garbage. Oh, that's a good one. All right, you get the point. No more of these. So anyway, thank you for listening. This, I think, illustrates Father Seraphim Rose's point. I'm sure you could find your own endless supply of nonsense, meaningless, garbage art with a few clicks of the button. God bless. We will have a new episode in the next day or two. And got a little surprise. I'm going to tell you what the surprise is, but it's a little surprise. I got my 2 Julian books. We have not touched Mr. Julian Huxley yet, have we? Hey, we have not. Now, we've done Aldous. We did Brave New World. But we haven't done Julian. And Julian is crucial. He's the guy who coined the term transhumanism. He's the guy who said, let's do UNESCO. That way we can control culture globally. But he also wrote an interesting book that we're going to do called On Living in a Revolution. And he's talking about the final revolution. The same thing that Aldous was talking about in the introduction to Brave New World. The same thing that Father Rose is explaining in Nihilism. All of the revolutions have been leading up to this final revolution, the nihilist revolution. So look for in the next couple of days. Now, the reason I said 2 books is because the UNESCO essay, the famous essay on the purpose of UNESCO, is not that long. It's 50, 60 pages. So that doesn't really suffice for, the Jay's Analysis 2-hour talk. So I'm going to probably do that and include some of the On Living in a Revolution book, depending on how much I get read of that. But I'm told, at least, that On Living in a Revolution is very instructive for the overall elite plan. So we will see as we get through these books. But I think one thing it's going to be telling, because I've already started the UNESCO book, the purpose of UNESCO. And what does he think? What do you think he says first thing right away? What's it all about? Evolution. Dogma number 1, the guiding philosophy, evolution. Can't question that. And again, so we see, without a doubt, across the board, every one of the books in the Globalism book series, dogma number 1, you cannot question, you must accept, evolution, Darwinism, and that is non-negotiable. Every one of the globalists has Darwinism as dogma number 1. All right, thank you for listening. God bless you guys. Sorry this was a little late. I had a lot of stuff I was trying to get done this week. I really wanted to test out the new camera and churning out videos, so that's why we kind of experimented with the new camera with some of the more kind of goofy, silly videos that I did this week. So I wasn't being lazy. I was learning this new camera, which basically any tech that you buy nowadays is a supercomputer. So this camera was a whole new world from a older handheld Handycam HD that I had, which is kind of crappy. So I started to learn the ways of this new computer, anyway, so getting quicker at Final Cut and producing videos. So thank you guys, and stay tuned. I promise this time around it won't take that long, because the UNESCO book is pretty short. So look for that next.